on today's StoryBeat.
To the aspiring writer who has always wanted to give it a try, I would just strongly encourage you to try it, right? It's going to be difficult. Writing that first chapter, that first paragraph is incredibly difficult. But I think you will find that if you accomplish that and take it a step at a time, it comes together.
This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today, Thomas Cullen, is a federal trial judge and former U.S. attorney in Virginia. He was recently honored as the 2024 Carter O. Lowance Fellow from the William and Mary Law School, which is his alma mater. A native of Richmond, Virginia, Thomas studied history and ran track at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina, from which he was recently awarded an honorary doctorate. Thomas is also an accomplished writer. For more than 10 years, he regularly published op-eds and essays in national and regional media outlets until his appointment to the bench made publishing further such articles prohibitive. However, he didn't stop writing. In 2025, he published his first novel, Charlie Man, which I've read and can tell you is a beautifully written, fictional coming-of-age story that reads like a powerful, heartfelt memoir. Charlie Man is for readers of all ages, from teens on up. It will have strong resonance for anyone who's ever struggled with love and loss throughout their teenage years. So for all those reasons and many more, I'm truly privileged to welcome the respected jurist and brilliant writer, Thomas Cullen, to StoryBeat today. Thomas, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's my great privilege. So let's go back in time just a little bit. At what point in your life, how young were you when you first became interested in books and storytelling?
So I was privileged to have a mom who read to me as a child. And I remember vividly being age 4, 5, 6, 7, sitting with my two sisters. I also have a little brother who wasn't born yet. We would sit in her bedroom every night and she would read to us. I was never a great student until later in life, but I always was an avid reader. I love books. And I think because I was an avid reader, I became an able writer. And fortunately, I was able to use those skills in the practice of law and in my professional career.
And how did you use those skills in the practice of law?
A lot of folks don't know that most lawyers and lawyers generally do a lot of writing. A lot of it is not very good writing and not something that anyone wants to read. But effective lawyers are skilled writers. A big part of being an advocate is written advocacy. I felt like by the time I became a practicing lawyer, I was a decent writer. Through the practice of law over the last 20 plus years, I've honed those skills and improved those skills. We always improve as writers, and that's something that has been important in my career from start to the current day.
So I've had you'd say good fortune or poor fortune to have dealt with a lot of lawyers in my life, including members of my family, but also in my own personal life. I've dealt with lots of lawyers. And one of the things I've noticed about lawyers is they're very good at telling stories, not necessarily fictional stories, but they're storytellers. Is that something that you find to be true with most good, especially trial lawyers?
No, absolutely. Particularly for trial lawyers, right? You have to establish a narrative. What is this case about? To interest a jury, to interest a judge, to put things in layman's terms and capture and hold an audience's attention. So whether you're doing that standing in the well of a courtroom or through a brief, that's always the goal, and it should be in the back of your mind when you're kind of marshaling the facts and coming up with a narrative and making an argument.
And coming from the beginning of a story to the middle of a story to the end of a story in a trial sense is very important, just like it is in a novel.
Absolutely, it's critical. You have to stay with the script, right, and try not to deviate and make the points that you need to make and make them effectively.
So you've also always then been a reader of fiction, yes?
Yes, fiction and nonfiction. I'll read anything you put in front of me. I think my worst nightmare would be to be stuck in a room without something to read.
Well, that's that old cliche. If you were going to be stuck on a deserted island, what book would you like to have with you, you know?
Absolutely.
What writers did you admire as a kid, and who do you admire now?
Sure. So as a kid, coming up in terms of fiction, I loved Ernest Hemingway. Read almost everything he wrote.
Mm-hmm.
Robert Penn Warren's All the King's Men is probably my favorite novel. I loved Catcher in the Rye. In terms of fiction, those are probably my favorites, but I'm an avid reader of nonfiction and biography. I'm a big Winston Churchill fan. I've probably read every biography, including William Manchester trilogy on Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was himself a great writer, and that's something I've always admired about.
Winston Churchill's one of the most brilliant writers who's ever lived.
No question.
And you mentioned Catcher in the Rye. It's interesting. Just this afternoon, as I was reviewing my notes for tonight, I thought to myself, your book is somewhat reminiscent of Catcher in the Rye. It has that quality to it.
Well, I appreciate that. That's a compliment. J.D. Salinger, I mean, that was a watershed work in the early 1950s, and it has lasting resonance and importance today. But most folks don't know this about me. Before I was a practicing lawyer, before I went to law school, I taught 10th grade English.
Oh, really?
At an all-boys prep school in Virginia, and Catcher in the Rye was part of the syllabus that year, and I had 4 different sections and got to read it 4 or 5 times and teach the novel, and it was great fun.
Well, I think it shows in your work. That's what I really noticed. It has that tone and tenor, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. When did you start to write? How old were you when you began to seriously think about writing?
So I had great teachers along the way. I was privileged to attend a school that emphasized writing and good writing and teaching the basics in terms of grammar and style and usage, from diagramming sentences to constructing essays and the like. So I had an interest in writing early on, carried through college where I worked for the college newspaper, wrote op-eds and essays. And then even as a practicing lawyer, in addition to writing briefs and the like, I would regularly write op-eds for various news outlets on legal topics, political topics, and the like. And then when I became a judge, I could no longer opine on current events and politics and those sorts of things. So I had to find a new outlet.
So did you take writing classes in school before you ever thought about the law?
I never took, I went to a liberal arts college, so I took English and communications and history, did a lot of writing in my spare time, but, didn't specialize in creative writing or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. So your training is just by having written a lot.
Correct. Just writing a lot as a student, writing a lot as a lawyer, and writing every day as a judge.
Well, I bet you do write every day a lot as a judge, and you probably read a whole lot too.
I do, and not all of it's good.
Well, I do know for a fact certain that as a screenwriter, I've taught screenwriting for almost 15 years. And one of the things that I teach in my classes is if you ever want to see how not to write dialogue, just read a deposition.
I think that's probably very true.
Well, because the stenographer is capturing all the ums and ers and stops and starts, and it makes no sense half the time. I mean, you read it, it doesn't have any dramatic drive at all.
Right. Now, as a lawyer, you think you were so eloquent until you read the transcript of what you're
I'm sure that's exactly right. So for you, what makes a good story good?
So, it's in the eye of the beholder. But I think, and I teach law students this when I speak to them, you have to establish a narrative and grab the reader right from the outset. And in legal writing, right, so we're talking about mundane business disputes and accidents and medical malpractice cases, you have to find the story within the dense and dull subject matter. And I think good writers who are lawyers can do that effectively. It takes patience, it takes ingenuity, it takes creativity, And it takes a lot of time and work, but there's always a story in something, and you have to find the story, establish the story, and carry it through.
Absolutely. I also imagine that in your time as both a lawyer and a judge, you've met and dealt with lots of, I'm putting air quotes up, characters in your life.
No question.
Are you able to use those observations in your writing?
I probably do. In terms of the novel Charlie Man that I wrote, certainly folks that I encountered along the way as a young man during my formative years played a significant role in the characters in the particular novel. I've yet to write a book about being a lawyer and some of the folks I've encountered along the way as a prosecutor and a defense attorney. I may very well do that at some point, and certainly if I did, I would likely draw on some of the characters that I've had the good fortune to be around.
I have no doubt you've seen many. Are you a fan of John Grisham and Thoreau?
No, absolutely. I was a fan of John Grisham. The Firm, I think, was the blockbuster that came out even before Time to Kill. Time to Kill, I think, was his first novel. Wasn't a commercial success. The Firm put him on the map. I read them all early, and I probably read everything he's written. He is a Virginian. He's a Mississippian native, but he makes his home outside of Charlottesville, Virginia. So we claim him as our own.
You may as well. So I think that you probably would write some really excellent legal thrillers. I think that's what you should think about.
Well, I'll have to give it some thought. If I have some time, maybe we can make that happen.
Well, there you go. Let's talk about Charlie Man for a bit. Tell the listeners more about what Charlie Man is about.
Sure. So Charlie Man is a coming-of-age novel. It's set in a unique place, Richmond, Virginia, where I was born and raised. At that time, a sleepier southern city. It's now a major metropolitan area and a progressive southern city. It was less so in the early to mid-1990s when I was in high school. But it's set in a unique time. So it's circa 1994, 1995, and this is the pre-internet, pre-social media, pre-cell phone age. But that said, it deals with a teenage protagonist who is dealing with things that are timeless in terms of challenges, things that young folks have faced as long as humans have walked the face of the earth, in terms of loss of a parent, anxiety, fraught friendships, first loves, and the like. So it deals with all of those timeless challenges and themes, but in a unique place at a unique time, before kids were wedded to their phones and actually talked face to face and had lengthy conversations.
Well, the old writing cliche is write what you know, which I always say is not necessarily from your life. It's just what you know in your heart to be true, or from your research. In this case, you wrote a story that takes place among teenagers from a period of time when you were a teenager. So how did you go back and relate to all that? Did you take notes back in the day? Did you keep journals?
I didn't. I was going off vivid memory for the most part. For a long time, thought one day I would take a stab at writing a novel, and I knew how the first chapter would go, but I didn't know much beyond that. And the project kind of came about after several conversations with my wife. I had written an essay on fly fishing in the winter with my golden retriever, and I had such a ball doing that. And she just said, you ought to try to write a novel. And I kind of laughed it off and thought about it for a week, and then one evening, I said, you know what, I'm going to try to start that first chapter I've thought long and hard about. I did, and it just started to flow.
So why do that now? Why did you decide to, what happened in your life that's now, as opposed to 5 years ago or 5 years from now?
So, that's a great question, and I'm not sure what the answer is. I guess at some point you come to the realization you're not getting any younger, right?
That's for sure.
Memories fade. And as you get older, you have less energy in industry that may have when you're a little bit younger. And I just felt like this was a good time, and I was in a station in life where I was able to spend time early in the morning before court and on the weekends to devote to the project. And I just decided to make a go of it.
Is that when you write early in the morning?
Yeah, I do my best work probably first thing in the morning. I'm an early riser, and after having coffee and getting ready for the day, I think probably I'm a little more focused than I am later in the day and in the evening. And I've found over the course of my career as a student and as a lawyer that I do my best work early rather than later.
And how much time could you typically devote to writing in the morning?
So it depended on the day. Usually I would have an hour and a half to 2 hours before I had to turn to other things. Sometimes if a case is settled or trials went away, I would have an hour during the day to turn back to it, and then would spend a lot of time on Saturdays and over the weekend working on it. Going into it, I had no idea how long it would take, but I found once I started, I enjoyed it so much that things just kind of flowed, and I was able to put together the manuscript in about 3 months. Now, that said, I spent a year editing, rewriting with the help of a really talented publisher. At least the first draft just kind of came out.
Well, I've always said to people that the craft of writing is that first draft, and then the art of writing and storytelling is the revisions.
No question. I learned early on in my career as a lawyer that the editing is oftentimes more important than the writing.
Oh, inevitably, because that first draft is usually not very good. I don't know if have you ever read? Now I'm forgetting her name. It's Annie. Well, anyway, the book is called Bird by Bird. Have you ever read?
No.
I'm trying to remember Annie's last name, and I'll think of it in a second. But she has it's all about being a writer and writing. And she has an entire chapter called Shitty First Drafts.
It's true.
It's true. It really is. And Annie Lamott is her name. I knew I'd think of it in a second. I highly recommend it. It's an outstanding book about writing and being a writer. So where did you begin in this process? Did it begin with characters or with plot?
So I think it began with characters. I knew who the protagonist was. I knew who his best friend was. I knew he would have a girlfriend. I knew that there were important influences on his life in terms of teachers, coaches, a strong personality, mother. So it was character driven, and then the plot kind of took shape from there. It's interesting. You're a screenwriter. The most daunting part for me, and the thing I was most worried about, was dialogue. As a lawyer, you don't write dialogue, and that was the one aspect I wasn't sure I could pull that off. And as I got into it, I just found myself in the shoes of these characters, as an 18-year-old boy, just imagining how would you have put that? What would you have said? What's the wise ass comeback, right, that you would have used in that particular situation? And I just had a ball doing that. So it ended up, the dialogue wasn't nearly, it was still challenging, but I thought I was able to pull it off in the end.
It was freeing for you because it wasn't your day job and it wasn't what you normally write.
Right. That's exactly right. So that was an important piece. And then, I'm sometimes asked, are you regimented by an outline or seat of your pants type writer? And I'm probably a little bit of a hybrid. So I didn't have a clear sense of how the plot would develop when I started. But as the book progressed, I started to anticipate and think about twists and turns. And as ideas would come to me, a lot of times when I try to run every day on the trails in the mountains here outside of my home, I would get back from a run and take out a piece of scratch paper and kind of map out the next couple of chapters.
Mm-hmm. You were thinking steps ahead. You weren't confronting each chapter fresh like you had no idea. You were actually thinking ahead.
I was, yes.
I talked to plenty of writers on this show that do either or both. Most writers are outliners, but there are quite a few who just go at it. I don't know how you do it. I'm an outliner, so I need to know where I'm going before I sit down to write. It's just the way it works for me. What do you think it is about Charlie that hooks you right in?
So I think Charlie as a character, hopefully folks can relate to someone in terms of being a mediocre student, but someone who's I think wise, and maybe wise beyond his years. He's empathetic. He's got a wry sense of humor. He takes setbacks in stride. He deals with a lot of crap, but at the end of the day, I think he shows a certain resilience and the ability to persevere. So hopefully the reader can identify with having these challenges, but facing challenges with aplomb and keeping your head up and continuing to move forward.
So you have some terrific themes throughout this book, and they really do relate to teenagers in particular, though I think to everyone in general. You have competition and bullying and abuse and ambition to forge ahead in your life, certainly love lost and heartache and brotherliness that gets all messy, especially between your two protagonists, more or less, and betrayals and growing up. Was this something that you've thought about for a long time, or did it just flow out of you as you were working?
So I think it flowed out as I was working, and I think subconsciously, you're aware of what are you trying to accomplish here, right? What is the implicit message, right? What do you want the reader to take away from this particular situation and how he handles himself? So I think that's an important aspect.
Are you able to say what that is without giving anything away?
So I think I'd be lying if I said it was overly intentional on my part. But at the same time, I mean, it's faults, right? Going to a prep school and all the baggage that comes, through that experience. And, every experience is different and they have their positives and their negatives. And there's certainly a lot of negatives with growing up in kind of a privileged environment and going to a school like that. It does teach you certain things, right? And I was fortunate to have teachers and coaches and friends who, through struggles and challenges, really taught me to, you've got to move forward. You got to keep your head up. Life is tough. Suck it up and make the best of it.
Well, I'm one of those people that found being a teenager very difficult. It was not fun for me. I couldn't wait to be an adult. And as I look back, I think, how did I get through that? But you do. You kind of like, you're living one step every day and you learn from it. And I think that is how we mature and become people.
And no question. And, the current generation, and I have two teenage children, right? It's different. And one of the things I worry about, Steve, is this generation, are these kids equipped to deal with life, right? Are they as resilient as prior generations?
Well, I think the thing that has altered it inextricably with all the challenges is the cell phone and computers and all these screens. I think this has changed our humanity in a huge way. Don't you agree?
And there's no question in terms of shortened attention spans and how people socialize with each other. One could argue it's just not a normal way to go through life.
Well, Charlie Man is a good example of how it was. I'm not sure you'd write a novel the same way today about today.
There's no question. And I couldn't do it because I don't fully understand.
Well, I think that's part of the problem is I think very few people understand it. I think even the people that are young and in it don't understand it.
I think that's very true.
And it'll probably be a generation or two when people look back and finally break it down and figure it out. And so that's what's almost relieving about reading Charlie Man is that it takes you back to for lack of a better cliche, a gentler, kinder time, even though the characters in this book go through hell.
Yes, no question, right? It's got its positives and its negatives. I think one of the positives is that we related to each other a little bit differently.
So you wrote this, as I said in the intro, it feels like memoir, even though it isn't. I assume that there's a degree of autobiographical stuff in here, but it's not an autobiography, correct?
It's not an autobiography, right? I mean, I grew up in that city at that time. I think several of the characters are familiar to the author. There are no dead ringers. There are composites of people that I knew. I have a lot of friends in Richmond, Virginia, who I grew up with, and folks who were teachers of mine and knew me back then, and they love to try to guess who some of these characters are. And And I won't admit to anything because I don't want to be sued. It is a novel, and there are no dead ringers.
Well. Okay. So I'm not going to try to pry legal advice out of you, but could you be sued as a novelist for writing characters that are based on people you know?
No, I don't think so. Fiction is fiction insofar as you're holding the book out as a work of art or work of fiction. By and large, I think you're protected in terms of libel. Hopefully that's the case.
Well, authors write romana clefs, which are very much closely related to real characters. And I guess as long as they're in the public domain, the characters in the public domain, then you're okay. But I think you're extraordinarily good at setting tone. I mentioned that earlier on. I'm just curious, is there anything that you did intentionally to set the tone of the book?
I don't know that it was intentional. I was trying to be authentic, right, in terms of my voice and the characters is I recalled them. So to say that I set out to do that, I think I'd be lying to claim it.
Where did the emotions in the book come from? I mean, where are you an emotional person, or is this?
My wife would say I am not an emotional person. I can be emotional, in term when you have children, it's hard not to be emotional. I think you get more sentimental as you get older. But given the nature of my job and most of the work I've done over the course of my career, you can't be overly emotional. So I think this was cathartic, right? In some respects, you can get out of that world and recollect and reminisce, be a little more unguarded.
Again, it's a freeing thing for you because of the type of job you do.
No question. And I was heavily invested in it. I mean, I found, Steve, when I finished the first draft for several days, I was sad. I missed those characters and kind of being part of their life. I mean, I was reliving to a certain extent being that age and having those experiences. And that was a cool thing for me.
Well, have you thought about writing a sequel to it? Where would Charlie Mann be today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. There's a possibility. Maybe there's a sequel at some point, or maybe something entirely different. Charlie, I think we leave him and he's in a pretty good spot. He's been through a lot, but he's got a long life to live. So who knows?
Well, because we won't give anything away, but he faces both life and death in the book. And for sure, he has to contend with a lot of things. I found some of the scenes difficult to read, especially the stable scenes. Those were challenging. Did you experience anything like that as a kid, where you had people and violence and that kind of thing?
I think the way I'll answer that particular scene is probably more familiar to the author than perhaps some of the others. And I'll probably should leave it at that.
Well, that's good. Yeah, you should leave it at that.
That was probably a little more memoir than some of the other parts of the book.
Well, I think that's powerful stuff is what it is. And I think that bleeds through in there, that it's that powerful to you, the author. So where did Charlie come from? He was a football and track star. You were a runner?
I was a runner. I played football through JV, but I was a terrible football player. I weighed about 140 pounds. Used to get the crap kicked out of me.
What position?
So JV, I played tight end and defensive back. I was a pretty good blocker as a tight end, just a gangly. I was probably 5'11", 140 pounds. I could hold the line, but I was a pretty poor tackler.
Well, at 140 pounds, what kind of a defensive back are you going to be?
Not much of one. Not much of one. To the extent I have any athletic ability, it was as a runner.
And you have this marvelous three-part relationship that's in the story between Charlie and Bo and Katie, and I never went through anything like that in my life, so I found it interesting to read. I think that people who have been through that, and I won't give that away either, that people have been through where there are three people involved, that it can be very, very challenging.
No question, particularly if you're 18 years old, right?
Particularly if you're 18 years old. I think, listen, I don't think it's easy when you're 50 either, but at 18, yeah, that's really tricky. Did you use any particular techniques from any kind of books or advice from anyone regarding how to create the characters, how to put them together and make them three-dimensional?
I didn't. And maybe I should have, but this was, I just kind of started, and the characters developed organically, certainly through the editing process with input from my publisher and copy editor. They helped me refine and build and challenge certain aspects and improved the characters probably significantly. But in terms of kind of formulaic, this is how you do it. No, I didn't do that.
You got notes from people on this?
Yes.
And did you have a specific editor that you worked with?
I did. So my publisher, Brandy Lane, I was fortunate going into this project. I mean, I had no idea how this worked, right? And how unique this industry is and just how difficult it is, right, to get a book published. I was very naive. I mean, I feel like as a judge and an established lawyer, I know a lot about a lot of things. I didn't know anything about this. But I was fortunate early on in the process to find a publisher that was based in Virginia. I think part of the reason they were interested in the book to begin with is because this is a judge writing, a young adult novel, and that's worth our time to at least give it a read. So they agreed to read it, and we were able to figure out arrangement to publish it. They were just fantastic. I was really, really impressed from a small indie publisher, the amount of support in terms of getting the manuscript polished and ready to go, and then through the publication process and everything that follows.
Well, as I say, I've been doing this show for a long time, and I've had a number of lawyers on the show, but I've never had a judge on the show. So that says something about the fact that you are unusual in that you wrote a novel while on the bench.
Well, yeah, yes.
What did you do you think, to avoid the characters feeling stereotyped? Because they do not. They feel very rich.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm not sure what the answer is. I was just trying to create authentic characters that were, close in terms of disposition and the way they go about life to the folks that I encountered along the way. You can stereotype anything, and I'm sure you can stereotype some of these characters, but to the extent you think that I did a decent job trying to avoid major stereotypes, I will take that as a compliment.
Well, it's very easy for people to think, I love X book. I like Catcher in the Rye. I'll just write a book that's like Catcher in the Rye. And that imitation always comes off to me as two-dimensional or cardboard. It doesn't feel real. And so what you did, I think, felt very authentic. In fact, part of the authenticism of it, or authenticity, I think is the right word, it would be that you have this story that takes place in your hometown where you grew up, and at an age that you experience certain things. And so that's part of the authenticity of it. Did you need to do any further research? Did you have to go back into the archives or library or anything to research things?
I really didn't. And I've been asked that. Did you go back to the dam and the river and where you used to hang out? And I didn't, because you can't. They've now built, houses, and it's changed so much
naturally
in 30, 35 years. So I get arrested for trespassing if I attempted that today.
Even the neighborhood, which is very vividly drawn in the book, that's gone too?
The neighborhood is there. This is so the novel is essentially set in what's called the Near West End of Richmond, which is kind of the old established part of Richmond neighborhoods, the big elm trees and oak trees and poplar trees, the colonial type houses, the serpentine walls and the like. So a lot of that is still there, where part of the book is set on the river, this old house and a bluff, undeveloped land. A lot around that has now been developed.
And that's sort of old Richmond, isn't it?
That's old Richmond.
It doesn't go back to the Civil War, does it? Or does it go back that far?
The city itself?
No, this neighborhood, the houses.
The neighborhood would be post-Civil War, turn of the 20th century.
Got it. And where does St. Mark's Episcopal School come from? Is that based on a real school?
Yeah, so it's loosely based on a real school. I actually attended a co-ed school. St. Mark's in the book is an all-boys school. And I think readers who are familiar with Richmond would quickly identify which particular all-boys school that was a rival of my school that it's loosely based on.
All right. So what do you think the biggest challenges you faced in writing the book was? Was it time? Was it development? What do you think the biggest challenge was for you?
So I think going in, as I said, dialogue was a significant challenge. Carving out time was always a challenge. And then until I was able to get a publisher, just figuring out how I was going to get this project completed and out into the world, which I think is a great challenge for most writers who want to accomplish something like that.
So you clearly secured a book deal. I think we alluded to the fact that that you are a judge, and that was probably intriguing in part to the publishers. But what do you think a writer should do in order to get a publisher or attract a publisher? What do you, from your experience here, what do you think is important?
Being willing to kind of think outside the box, right? There are scores of reputable indie publishers, small publishers that are all over the United States and all over the world. It's very difficult, number one, to find an agent, number two, to get one of the big four publishers to pick up your novel. One of the things I learned through this process is, the whole market for fiction is just changed, and the days of advances and royalties and all of those things are, unless you're John Grisham and one of the 20 best-selling authors regularly, you're not going to be able to go that route, particularly as a unpublished first-time novelist. It's almost impossible. You have to have a track record. You have to have a social media platform. They got to be able to market you.
And you can't have a social media platform, right?
Yeah, and I can't, right? Given what I do, and that was one of the challenges in marketing this. I mean, I can't put out content and plug things and plug myself. I just can't ethically as a judge. So that was a challenge. So I think authors, aspiring authors, need to be willing to think outside the box and try an indie publisher. Think about, I don't know, if self-publishing works for everyone, but insofar as that is a viable option for folks, they ought to consider it. At the end of the day, if you have a good book and you want to share it, you got to be willing to do what it takes to get it out there.
That's correct. And the market is saturated with books at this point. And there are, I can't remember what the number is. It's 70, 80, 90,000 books a year are published. And it's very difficult to break through and get people to pay attention to it. Just like the podcast. Podcasting is the same thing. There are 5 million podcasts, literally 5 million. And everybody. And so you have to figure out how to break through that too. I'm curious, in both your professional life and your writing life, you have had to deal with some kind of pressures. I assume that the pressures as a trial lawyer and then a judge, there are different kinds of pressures. Is there anything you do creatively to tamp down pressure in your life or to deal with pressure?
Look to my creative juices to tamp down pressure necessarily. It's interesting. I spoke to some law students earlier this week, and I had a similar question. How do you deal with the pressure of high-profile cases? And my answer to them in that context, and I think it's true for writing or really anything else, is that hard work and preparation go a long way. And I don't claim to be brilliant. I'm not, but I've always, in terms of the work that I enjoy, I put in the time and the effort, and I don't take things for granted. And I think there's a lot to be said for that.
Well, I think it has to show, because you're full-time on a difficult job and you then publish a novel. You must be a very hard worker. You aren't sitting around twiddling your thumbs, that's for sure.
I like to stay busy.
Well, that's a good thing. I want to talk for a moment about writing articles, which you did for a long time. So you've published op-eds and essays. How do you think that doing that impacted the discipline required to write the novel?
So it's a different genre, right? Different style, a different purpose, but it requires the same type of discipline. And ultimately, one of the things I to the extent I pride myself on anything, is that I try to be consistent in my writing, whether I'm writing an opinion or writing an op-ed or writing this particular novel. I want the writing to be accessible, right? So when I'm writing opinions, the last thing I want is it to be larded up with legalese and just to be boring and dull and uninteresting. It's really important for me to try to craft prose in a way that is just clear and simple and concise and really grabs the reader.
Well, if you write legal opinions the way that you wrote this book, then it's absolutely plain and clear. But I've never read any of your opinions, so I don't know whether that's true or not. I imagine that you probably struggle, or not struggles, not the right word, but don't care for lawyers that come in and do gussy it all up with legalese. Probably makes you a little crazy, I bet.
No, it does. Fortunately, most of the lawyers that practice for me on a regular basis are pretty decent writers, and their work product is fine. But that's not always the case. And I'll tell you this, as a judge, when you have someone who puts together a really polished brief and it comes in under 15 pages, and the opposition is 45 or 50, you've gone a long way to bring the judge around to your side.
Oh, all you lawyers out there, pay attention. Brevity is the soul of wit, as they say.
Absolutely. And it's harder, right? As a judge, it's harder to write the 10-page opinion than it is, to go on through 35 or 40 pages.
What's the famous Lincoln quote about, I'm sorry this letter is so long, I didn't have time, or I made it shorter?
Absolutely. It's so true.
I mean, that really is a great way to think about it. Do you prefer writing, now that you've been through it, do you have a preference whether you would rather write short stories or articles as opposed to the long form?
I really enjoyed the long form. It's all consuming, right? So it's not something I can do all the time and devote my energy to. But I enjoy the kind of the essay format. I always have. I think if I wasn't a lawyer and a judge, I would just hold forth and write op-eds, 900 words on whatever the heck I want, and make my point and make people laugh. I think that would be a fun way to make a living.
So how do you stay disciplined when perhaps you don't feel like it?
Gosh, that's a good question. I'm human like everyone else. I just think, you just have a conscience and guilt. You just got to get to work, right? You got to get something accomplished. I've always been kind of a list person, right? You go in at the start of the day, I've got to accomplish 4 things today, and you start working and you're able to check things off the list, and you feel better about yourself having done that.
Oh, there's no question. One of the things that we teach, and I know that it's difficult because as a human, you don't always want to work. There are distractions in your life and other things. But one of the things that we teach is that a professional, and it would be a professional at anything, let alone writing, but a professional does the work even when they don't feel like doing it.
No question. And Steve, here's what's interesting. I've heard several people say this, and it's so true with respect to writing. Good writers hate to write, right? They dread the prospect of having to sit down and write because they know it is so difficult, right? And they have such high standards for what needs to come out when they're at their computer. So I fall in that category myself. Sometimes when I have a big writing project ahead of me, I have trouble sleeping the night before because I know what it takes to turn that around.
So to me, there's always been 2 kinds of writers: those that love to write and those that love to have written. I'm in the latter category. I love to have written. The writing part of it is always challenging.
It is always challenging. If it's not challenging, it's probably not very good.
That's true. I think although you can point out certain writers of just prolific natures like Stephen King, where you know that he loves it so much he just bangs away?
Yes, he would probably be the exception.
One of the exceptions. Well, Neil Simon would have been an exception to churn out massive amounts of material. How do you refresh your creative well? What do you do?
So, I do lots of different things. I love the outdoors, and I have a cabin high up in the mountains in Virginia. I take my golden retriever and go fly fishing with him as often as I can. I'm out every day exercising, running on the trails, just spending time outdoors, spending time with my family. I've always been a big believer in leaving your work at work and stepping away from that and just enjoying downtime. And I think that's really important, just having that balance in other outlets. So that's a big part of it for me.
You obviously are very good at compartmentalizing things. You must be. But I'm curious, as you're writing your novel, you're also in your head thinking about what's happening at work and the various trials that are coming up and that you're writing opinions on and so on. Is there something that you are able to do where you can make that switch and not have them bleed into each other?
Yeah, so they're that different. And I had to be cognizant of, okay, I've got this coming up, so I probably need to set Charlie Mann aside for a couple of days and really be all in on what's coming down the pike.
And is it easy for you to do that where you can just shut it off?
It was, although as I got more involved and invested in the novel, I kept having to tell myself, no, you can't go back to that right now. You've got a day job and you need to get these other things done first.
When you're in the entertainment industry, and sometimes I'm sure for other novelists that are constantly writing novels, you're handling multiple assignments at one time, just like you're handling multiple trials at one time, I assume. And so that ability to compartmentalize becomes super important, or I think it would make it crazy.
No, you have to be able to compartmentalize and keep things in silos and go from one to the other. And when you're focused on the one, to be completely focused on that.
And I'm based on this conversation, my assumption is that when you got to the novel part of the day, that was like joy. And some of the trial stuff is just hard. It's just work.
For the most part, I think that was true. Although some of the trials and the cases are fun and interesting. Not all of them are. It's a job like anything else.
I'm sure that you do some really fascinating stuff, and it must be very interesting, especially as a federal trial judge. That's other stuff than we're used to hearing about most days on the news, which is a lot of local stuff. So I think that's really cool. I have been having just the most fascinating conversation. I'm wondering if you can share with us a story from your experiences, whether as a novelist or as a judge, doesn't matter, that's either weird, quirky, offbeat, strange, or just plain funny.
I feel like I'm a decent writer. I've done a lot of it over the course of my career, but I have to confess, I'm an average speller, but I'm not a very good speller of names. And when I was in college writing for the school newspaper, writing op-eds, I cranked out an op-ed. And this is, in the days before I became pretty proficient at editing my own work, you feel like once you put the last period in place, you were done and get the thing in to the publisher and you could go on to the next thing. And I had referenced Oprah Winfrey in one of my op-eds and spelled her name Opera. Fortunately, I turned it in on a Tuesday, and I think it went to the publisher on Thursday. And I remember vividly on Wednesday, I saw, it was at a billboard or something, advertising an opera. And I just looked at that and I thought, gosh, that's interesting. And it just dawned on me, you better go back. I think you spelled Oprah opera. Turns out I had, but I was able to get to it before it was put in ink and save myself a lot of embarrassment. So the lesson there is know your weaknesses and double, triple check the spelling of names.
You do realize that Oprah is Harpo backwards.
Yes, I do. Yeah, I do now.
In fact, that's the name of her company on top of everything else is Harpo. All right. So last question for you today, Thomas. You've given us a huge amount of just outstanding advice throughout the whole show. But I'm wondering if you can share with someone who's starting out as a writer, or maybe they're in a little bit trying to figure it out, a good piece of advice or a tip.
So I would say two things. One is to the aspiring writer who has always wanted to give it a try. I would just strongly encourage you to try it, right? It's going to be difficult. Writing that first chapter, that first paragraph is incredibly difficult. But I think you will find that if you accomplish that and take it a step at a time, it comes together, and you just have to stick with it. Set reasonable goals in terms of output and production, whether it's 250 words a day, 500 words a day, or 1,000 words a day. Just try to move the story along a little bit at a time, and you will find that you will be able to accomplish what you set your mind to. The second piece of advice I would have is don't quit your day job, right? Odds are you're not going to make a lot of money doing this. Do it because you love it, because you have a story to tell, and because you're proud of your work. Don't do it because you think you're going to make a fortune, because you're not. But that doesn't mean you don't have a good book and a good story to tell.
Two outstanding pieces of advice. Thomas Cullen, this has been a fantastic episode of StoryBeat. And for those of you that are interested, check out Charlie Man. I'm sure you can find it not only at Amazon, but at other fine booksellers, and give it a shot. Thank you so much, Thomas, for being on the show.
Thank you, Steve. It's been great.
And so we've come to the end of today's StoryBeat. If you like this episode, won't you please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. StoryBeat is available on all major podcast apps and platforms, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and many others. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.